Welcome back to Coats and Conversation. I'm your host, Kendrick Coates, a licensed therapist for couples and athletes in Illinois and Alabama. In today's conversation, I speak with Stacy Stoddard, a licensed marriage and family therapist in Maryland. Stacy is also an EMDR therapist and trainer. We discuss topics ranging from what EMDR is, some of the misconceptions of EMDR. We also explore how EMDR can be beneficial for high performers. And then we end today's conversation discussing what people should look for when they're searching for an EMDR therapist. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did having it. Stacy, how are you doing today?
I'm well, thanks. Thanks for having me today.
I am looking forward to this episode. Obviously, I went through one of your EMDR trainings, but I think EMDR is starting to grow in popularity amongst the mental health space because of just so many benefits, which we'll get into that. But before we get started, for the listeners and viewers, can you share how you got to the point that you are in your career now?
Let's see, my path to become a therapist was a little curvy. I'll spare you that part. But once I became a therapist, I had not been one for too awful long when I got trained in EMDR, probably almost 25 years ago. And not a lot of people knew what EMDR was. I was always the one saying to my clients, "Hey, I learned this weird thing and I think it might help you." And they go, "What?" And that has changed a lot over the last 25 years, which I think we'll talk about as we go along. And then I got trained in lots of other things and always come back to EMDR as like my favorite thing for reasons we'll continue to talk
Mhm.
about. But because of that, I kept kind of growing in my EMDR learning and getting consultation and taking advanced trainings and just kind of shifted into actually being a trainer and love that. I spend, probably I'd say my workload now is probably like 70% education, 30% clinical work, as that has shifted, as, like you said, the growing popularity of EMDR, more and more people want to get trained. And I own a small group practice in Maryland, and we all shockingly do EMDR as well. Yeah.
It's interesting how some of us find EMDR. And a lot of times, even some of the clients that I work with, they're like, "Yeah, we heard about this type of therapy is like voodoo." And I kind of laugh because that was kind of my perception of EMDR. I'm like, wait, hold on. You just go to a therapist and they wave their finger in front of your face. And I'm just like, there's no way that this has any type of benefit in healing. So I want to dive into the nuances of EMDR because a lot of people just don't know, and that's okay. I think it's one of those things where it can also be scary when you think about something completely different, and a lot of people are already coming into vulnerable spaces. So, for the listeners who might not be familiar with EMDR, can you explain what it is and how it works?
Yeah. So it's a little bit of voodoo where somebody no, I'm just kidding, but I hear you on that for sure. Because it does feel a little bit like some magic of some sort in that it really does move people through their traumas, or what I even say, just their stuck spots in life. It really does move them through it much faster. And some of what makes that happen, what you were referring to is kind of, waving your fingers in front of somebody's face. That is where they ideally follow your fingers as you move them back and forth. Their eyes move back and forth, and that activates bilateral stimulation in the brain. And the reason it's not as weird as it sounds is because our brains do this very naturally and organically when we go to sleep into REM sleep every night. That is how the brain naturally processes information. But things that feel yucky to us in our lives, whether we categorize it as a big trauma or not, just these yucky things, the brain has a hard time putting that where it needs to go when you go to REM sleep. That's just the nature of how trauma lives in the brain, how these yucky things work. And so our brains need a little help putting those where they need to go. And so EMDR really uses the body's natural mechanism of reprocessing, but uses it in a more structured, awake state. There's no altered state in EMDR. You're very much awake and present, using some of that bilateral stimulation along with some skill and guidance from the therapist to move through those stuck spots.
The I want to hit stay on that point for a second. So the stuck spots, those are kind of like areas where somebody may be working through a traumatic experience or an event that has happened and it has affected their, I say, nervous system in ways that doesn't allow them to regulate themselves again. But I want to ask, do you have to do a lot of talking when it comes to EMDR? And the reason why I ask that is because sometimes I see high performers, athletes, and more specifically, male clients who, generally speaking, a lot of us aren't taught how to express ourselves or talk about events. So, do you have to do a lot of talking when you're going through EMDR?
No, and I love that question because I think that is one of the things that makes EMDR a super effective and successful therapy for so many people. Because we don't like, let's say it's a memory that I just don't want to talk about. Great, we can still do EMDR. But let's also think about what if it's an issue that we just really don't understand about ourselves. Like, I mean, we're talking about some traumatic events or memories, but what if it's also just like, I just don't feel good and I don't know why. I just have always felt like I'm not as good as everybody else and I don't know why. So it's not like the person is scared to, or they just genuinely don't know. And EMDR works for that too. We don't have to have this super like, here's what happened and here's how it's impacting you. Tell me all about it and now let's work on it. It's just this beautiful entry into these neural networks that will in the end, not only help us understand the thing maybe we haven't been able to articulate, but it actually then that's the reprocessing component. It changes how it lives in the brain. So it's just kind of not a thing anymore.
I like that piece of it to where, because it, again, I mentioned earlier how difficult it can be, and as you mentioned, just talking through these things, it's just like it's yucky. You get stuck. You don't want to remember these things because they're so triggering to our bodies. So, can you speak on how EMDR has an effect on the nervous system? And the reason why I asked that one is because, and I'm thinking about dissociation when clients come to session and we are verbally processing a specific event. And I've heard that people can talk about the event and still be far removed from that event. So they're not really working through it to some degree. So can you explain how EMDR has that effect on the nervous system to help them get through maybe some of the steps that they would dissociate from?
Yeah, for sure. I'm just gonna, I'll just gonna put in a thing about talk therapy real quick too, because like you said, I, my own personal therapy sessions, I don't want to go and just talk about something and leave feeling worse. And the truth is, as a therapist, I really try to avoid that with my clients. I don't want us to just talk about something and not be able to what I call really work on it, make some progress with shifting how that lives in us not and some of that can come from talk therapy with like some aha moments, but what you're speaking to with the nervous system being involved and me talking about the neurobiology, like our bodies are involved in our memories. And if we can't get in there and kind of work on it in that way, the talking about it, like you said, just becomes a story and people dissociate from that. I mean, I've heard people tell really painful stories and never feel the story. They can be so separate from it. And people do that to survive and to manage it, but it doesn't help reprocess it and kind of change how it lives in the body. And so I think they're very well connected. And one of the things specific to EMDR that helps with this is this thing we teach in the EMDR protocol called dual attention, which is what it does is it takes the person into themselves, into their bodies, into their memories. It might feel a little uncomfortable, but then it brings us right back to the present moment, to them sitting right there with you in your office in the present moment. And then you go back into the memory, and then you come back to the present, and you go back into the memory and back into the present. And what that enables people to do is actually access the memory in more tolerable chunks, so to speak, right? For just a minute, I go into it, and the bilateral stimulation helps me like feel it, but then I get to come back out of it for a second, and then I get to go back into it. And what I've had clients tell me about that is, oh my gosh, Stace, like that wasn't really fun. Like EMDR can still be hard work, but man, that's better than what I do to myself at night when I'm trying to go to sleep. And I think about this memory, and now I'm going on and on and on. And there's not that this other kind of dual attention that really actually makes going into the memory more tolerable, and part of that is regulating the nervous system as we access that memory.
Like, I have so many questions because I'm just like my mind just like so like I know some of the stuff, but then like you're talking about things, I'm like, there's a question there, there's a question there.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
you made a point on clients can sometimes talk about a specific memory for decades or years or whatever, but not actually feel something. And
yeah,
I think I've heard people talk about, well, I've been going to therapy for 7 or 8 years, and I don't, by no means, let me preface by saying this, by no means am I discrediting or saying what somebody else is doing bad or inherently wrong, but I sometimes ask the question, what have you been working on in those 7 years, and have you actually gone back to, as we're talking, feel
yeah.
the emotions from that core memory? The other piece that I'd like you to kind of go into is, how do the narratives affect people? Because as we're talking through EMDR and talk therapy, and we can sit here and talk about traumatic experiences and not feel it, but how do the narratives that follow our core memory or our traumatic experience, how do those affect people?
Oh, immensely, immensely. So let's see if I can give an example. Um, let's say you were bullied as a kid, and you take on we all do this. We, like you're saying, we form some sort of narrative around that. So maybe the narrative was, I got bullied because I'm weird. There's something wrong with me. I was awkward. I was whatever. And so we form these narratives, and then we carry that self-belief with us into the rest of our lives, not consciously, we don't mean to, it's just how the brain works. And so we start to then, it becomes this like filter through which we see other experiences. So now maybe if I don't get a promotion at work, I'm going to carry that same narrative, which is, well, it's because there's something wrong with me. And what if this is part of what EMDR does, and why I mentioned earlier, it's not just about traumatic memories, it's about these narratives, it's about what we are telling ourselves. And so if we can shift that with EMDR, you get this freedom to have these new experiences without these old narratives and self beliefs laid on top of it. So next time you don't get a promotion at work, you're able to go, well, man, I know there's nothing wrong with me. So what's up here? Let me think about this in a new way. Maybe this isn't the job for me. Maybe, whatever. All these, there's these opportunities for new stories and new reframes, because your brain has been freed from this narrative that gets really ingrained with trauma memories and these kind of yucky experiences. And, like you were saying a minute ago, this is no one's fault. It's not because anybody has done anything wrong. It's just literally how our brain works in an attempt to keep us safe and help us navigate this really crazy thing called life. And there are ways then that our brain needs a little help to unstick those. And I think that's exactly what EMDR does.
The that you just mentioned, as far as like our brain does things to try to protect ourselves, and I think if we go to the core of what the brain does is keep survival,
For sure.
survival. So
Yep.
all of these events that can happen, and I like the way you mentioned kind of it could be a bullying experience. I mean, it
Yeah.
could even be something as getting an F on a test
Right.
and being shamed in front of a class.
Right.
And so these things, there's so many different layers to this. I'm curious to know, as somebody who is certified through IMDRIA as an EMDR therapist and who teaches therapists, what do you think some of the most common misconceptions about EMDR are, and how do you address those with clients or other therapists that you train?
Great question. I think one of them is I think a lot of people still think that EMDR is a technique, like it's something, oh, my client's going to come in with a problem and I'm just going to EMDR it. Like it's this like kind of worksheet that you pull out to do with them. And EMDR is so much more comprehensive than that. It's actually called EMDR therapy because it is an entire therapeutic modality. So when anytime anybody walks in my door as a new client, there's a whole way that I am framing all of the whole clinical work together based on EMDR therapy. And so I think that often blows some people's minds when they come through my training to learn that it's not just a technique I'm going to learn. It's a whole new way of conceptualizing how memories live in the brain, how people have survived, how they have what skills they really need or don't need to work on the memories. And so I think that's one, a misconception I see a lot. And then EMDR also has the reputation, and because it's true, that it is much faster, and that is it kind of resolves stuff for people much faster than talk therapy, and that is absolutely true. And it is still a therapeutic modality, right? We're not somebody's not going to be in and out the door in 6 sessions. We're still going to have to build some trust together and do some other things. And so I think balancing that it is quicker. And if we're going to work on some of these core memories, we're still going to do some other kind of therapeutic connection as well.
Curious, you said you're not going to generally speaking, 6 sessions generally is not enough. And I would agree with you on that. When we're thinking about EMDR and generally speaking, there's, some prep phases before we actually getting to reprocessing. Say somebody goes through a traumatic experience 2 weeks ago. Is that something that is beneficial for them?
Yes, I actually love this, because if we can do EMDR on something that just happened, it's actually there's a little bit of a different EMDR protocol, which is that we do because it is not that memory is not yet hooked up to long-term memory. So let's say I know you've got some athletes probably listening in, and listen, I'll fess up, I am no high performing athlete, but if I can imagine a world, let's say you're a runner and you trip and fall. You're doing a marathon, you trip and fall. That is going to impact your nervous system the next time you run, right? You're going to have this fear that's going to come up that maybe wasn't there before. Am I going to trip? Do I need to watch my feet? Whatever is happening. And if they could go to EMDR right away, if they already have an established therapist and whatever, and they could go and work on that fall immediately, that fall does not have time to hook up to long-term memory and become part of this bigger narrative, like we were just talking about, this bigger narrative of I might fail or I might not be good enough or something. It just like clears it out. It's really beautiful. So there are ways to use EMDR for something that happened immediately ago. I don't think that's technically a right way to say it, but you get my point. Versus like childhood stuff or even pre-verbal stuff.
I'm glad you gave the example with the runner
Mm.
who may be running and trips and falls, and it affects maybe the placement of that specific race. I'm thinking back just on my own experiences as an athlete in high school and college, and having several hamstring pulls and ACL injuries. To this day, sometimes I'm wondering, okay, I probably shouldn't do that because it puts me in kind of that similar position. So, can you speak on how EMDR could also help an athlete overcome a major injury? And I know you may have hit on it a little bit with the runner, but can you kind of go a little bit more in depth with I had a either a major concussion or a
Yeah.
major ACL injury. I'm afraid to get back on the field or the
Yeah.
court. What do I
Yeah.
need to do next?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think how it would help in those situations is help remove the fear-based response from the ability to actually listen to what your body needs without a fear-based response. My guess is if you're getting back on the field after an ACL repair, you should be a little cautious, right? Like you should be paying attention to how your body feels, what it's capable of, where you need to be careful and not careful. But where that gets complicated is when fear comes in on top of it. And then we start to often with fear we start to question ourselves, we start to doubt ourselves, we start to go, maybe I should, all these, like we were saying, old narratives come in. And if we could get rid of that after an injury through EMDR, you would be able to just go back out and go, how does my body feel? How am I doing with that?
Okay, so gone through the injury, and I've heard other clinicians in this space say, well, EMDRs, yeah, it's okay, but people end up back in therapy for that same thing they went to EMDR for. Are there reasons, or there, in your experience, reasons why somebody would come end up having to come back to therapy after working on their core memory or that target?
Well, I would I'm gonna quote Shrek here. People are like onion. Well, I think he said ogres are like onions, but right, there are layers to what we work on. And so we might work on something that gets us back in the field and we're feeling great. But then maybe something shows up that now we're able to access because we've worked on that. And now the fear is gone, but now some like who am I as a person? Maybe some existential stuff like kind of comes up. Or my other answer to your question is we're just human. Life keeps happening. Developmentally, we shift as we age. I know as a I'm gonna bite my tongue, middle-aged person, I have different thoughts, feelings, concerns than I did in my 20s. And so, of course, new things are going to emerge for me at this stage of life that didn't emerge for me at that stage of life, just because we're always growing, changing, evolving, having new life experiences. And so, I never think somebody needs to be in therapy forever. And I think it's really makes sense that things emerge in new ways as we change, develop, and grow. And I think that's great. And then we go back and we work on the next layer of the onion. And then we go back to life. And when we need the next layer, we return and work on that.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I agree with you as far as I'm a firm believer that nobody should be, well, generally speaking, a lifetime of therapy, we have to start asking questions like, okay, what's going on? But your piece said that you mentioned is we are evolving as people, but when we go through EMDR, and I've even seen it with myself. It's like whatever target I'm working on, and then like months later, I'm like, wow, I feel differently about a specific thing. But then I have new ideas about this specific thing, and then I'm like, man, I'm a little bit frustrated about it. So there's like you said, there's different layers to all of this. Curious to know, there's a lot of buzz around EMDR intensives. Can you explain what they are? And I guess for a little bit of context, extensives meaning longer therapy EMDR sessions. So can you kind of speak on that?
Yeah, sure. So the kind of quote normal model for EMDR therapy is kind of more the traditional talk therapy model that we think of, which is going to your therapist for about 50 minutes to an hour once a week. That's kind of the normal model. And you can definitely do EMDR within that model. But these intensives you're talking about are the therapist doing and client together doing EMDR for anywhere from 3 to 6 hours a day, sometimes even for multiple days in a row. And there's research behind this it has really great long-term outcomes that we're seeing in the research, and the benefit, I think, is to just kind of not, I don't want to say not have to drag it out, but you can do more in a shorter amount of time. And some people really like that. It fits their lifestyle better. Hey, let me come and do intense therapy for a week and really, with the EMDR and kind of be done with it. And then I also find that other people are not interested in that because they really feel like they need the time and space in between each session, and that intensity of it feels like it might be a bit much. And so I don't know that there's a right or wrong. Like I said, they're both research-based models. They both have great outcomes. But I think people who are, who kind of want to just jump in and get something done, I think is a great model for that.
In your
Mhm.
experience, and we may have talked off air about this, or maybe in your training about intensives, in your experience, are there certain things that come up for people that would make them a perfect candidate for an intensive therapy session versus just your typical 50-minute to an hour EMDR session?
Yeah. I think you're going to have a pretty good ability to kind of stay the course through difficult stuff. Because, and again, I think this is one of the benefits. If we've got 3 hours together, you can go into some really hard places. And my job as the therapist is just to help you move within that space, not to get you out of it. And you will get out of it, but it might be a rough 2 to 3 hours while you get out of it, and obviously emerge into a much better, healthier, more reprocessed space. But I think you're going to have to have the skills to be able to tolerate that, and maybe even more than that, you're gonna have to really be willing to go in and stay the course with it. So I think it's, maybe the most important, I don't know, kind of client-led thing is just the desire to do it, the willingness to stay the course, and, kinda trust the process.
I that reminds me of kind of when I was going through your training, how important that prep phase is because I just think of yeah, the EMDR is growing in popularity, intensives are growing in popularity, and unfortunately, there are some clients that are right off the bat put in intensives. And in my honest opinion, I think that does more damage in a lot of cases because that person isn't even prepared to one, regulate their own systems enough to be able to handle the intensity of
Yeah.
intensives. And then two, that can be a lot and scare people off because it's like if you, it's almost like you're swimming for the first time. We're going to go off the diving board in the deep end. And just like, I don't even know how to swim,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So it's like kind of the crawl before you walk and
Yeah.
then walk before you run
Yep.
versus, hey, you're just going to jump right into an intensive. And I think it does a lot of damage in a lot of cases. In your experience, what kind of outcomes have you seen with clients who choose EMDR over traditional talk therapy approaches, particularly in terms of speed of recovery and effectiveness?
Yeah, I mean, definitely quicker, like we've been talking about. People will I mean, I've heard all sorts of things, like people coming after one EMDR session, coming back and go, "Oh my gosh, Days, I just had the first, week of my entire life not having flashbacks." And again, that doesn't mean all the work is done forever, but man, people feel something different pretty quick upon starting EMDR. And the other thing I like to say that people really notice is that they don't have to white knuckle it through situations anymore. Like, before my mom would call and it'd be so stressful and I'd be like, remember the skills my therapist taught me, and like really trying to remember and work hard. And what people say after EMDR sessions is, it just doesn't bother me anymore. It's just not a thing. My mom calls and I go, whatever, here goes mom again. And I just get on with things. That it really isn't, it just fundamentally changes how people feel and respond in the world.
How people respond in the world.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
I'm just like thinking if we had a society where we were learning about these things all the way from grade school of just how to show up in a space without being triggered or getting defensive or whatever the case may be, I think so many people would be better off in navigating just life, but more importantly, relationships.
Yeah.
Because inevitably, kind of going back to what we talked about with narratives, the narrative could be, I'm not good enough. And that will influence how we show up in our relationships or even with other people. Uh, so
For sure.
so there's so much. We've went in depth with EMDR, what it is, how it works, intensives. What do you want those who may be on the fence about EMDR to know, or what should they be looking out for when they are seeking out an EMDR therapist?
Yeah. I would definitely look for an EMDR therapist that has, I mean, I don't be afraid to ask, how often do you use EMDR with your clients? Is this a regular thing you do? And the reason I say that is because I definitely see people come through my trainings and then they don't use it regularly. And so they just don't get a lot of practice with it. And this is a really intense trauma treatment. And so I think you're going to want a therapist who not only is trained in it, but actually uses it regularly, understands the ins and outs, kind of what you were speaking to a minute ago, understands how to prepare the client for it, to know when they're ready, to help them navigate these really, really hard spots. And so don't be afraid to ask your EMDR therapist, how often do you use this? And how it just any advice, I just do it, right? I mean, these are isn't that the Nike thing? Look at me, I'm being funny. This is just do it. I get that entering into the therapeutic space, if you've never done it before, can be really scary and it's vulnerable. But I'm telling you, if there's ever a way to do this, EMDR is the way to do it.
We probably could have talked for a number of hours about
I could talk all
EMDR.
day
Like
about EMDR. It's so great.
it
Yes.
is. There's just so much to it. And I think that one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation is because having information out there that's accessible to people when it
Mm,
comes to treatment, therapy, EMDR, recovery is so important. But I think the other part of it too is what should people be looking out for? And you hit it right on the head. How often does your therapist utilize EMDR? Because I've seen it and I've heard about it to where somebody goes to a therapist who is trained in EMDR, but they're only using it maybe once a week with one client.
yeah.
And to me, it's almost like if you don't use it, you lose it because there's so many different layers to the steps, especially how you teach it. There are
Mm,
steps and there's layers, and it is a very kind of step by step process. And if you miss a step, that can impact somebody's long term healing process.
yeah.
So I'm glad that you hit on some of those things, but I just want to take the time to thank you for being a leader in the space of mental health, but more importantly, with EMDR and training other clinicians out there. I've gone through your training and I was thoroughly impressed with how effective you were teaching it, but also we get into these breakout rooms and we're implementing it on, I think it was day one of
Yeah.
like talking about some of these things. And the other piece to that, and I'm kind of long-winded because intentionally because it's so valuable of what I've seen some of my clients go through. But those trainings where you're hands-on
Yeah.
is so key. I can't tell you how many trainings I've gone to, and it's just kind of a lecture, and I take notes and I go home and I don't even use the notes. Whereas
Yeah.
with your training, we're going through the material and we're doing it.
Yes.
So I just want to thank you for everything that you do for this field, all of the lives that you're changing, and all of the lives that you are, because it's therapist and then client. So your reach is so wide. And so thank you for everything you're doing. And thank you for coming on to Coats and Conversation to have this conversation.
Happy. Thank you for having me. And just to kind of name that you are part of that reach and you are making that reach too. And I think that's what's gonna help us all. So thank you for doing this.
Absolutely. Thank you. If you are listening to Coats and Conversation on YouTube, be sure to drop a comment. What was your favorite part about this episode? If you're listening to Coats and Conversation on Spotify or Apple, be sure to share this with somebody who may be on the fence about therapy or who may be on the fence about EMDR. I can't tell you enough of how effective therapy or EMDR has been to some of the clients that I've worked with, but more so my own EMDR sessions. So I can speak about this from a clinician and somebody who has been in it. This is one of the most effective therapeutic approaches that I've come across, and I've been going to therapy for several years. So share this episode with somebody who's just on the fence, they're not sure, or somebody who's just continually being triggered or just can't work through a specific thing in their life, because I think this episode can truly impact their lives.